Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Elire Strategy Summit. We're excited to host you over the next 2 days. This is the Overcoming Problems Leaders Are Faced with Today presentation. My name is Katie Bolt, and I'm the Business Development Associate here at Elire, and I'm going to be one of the moderators you guys will hear throughout the event. Before we get into today's presentation, I just want to cover a couple housekeeping items. Everyone has been placed on mute for the duration of the presentation. If time allows, we will have a live Q&A at the end. You can submit your questions in the Q&A portal or in the chat to panelists. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to our presenter, Richard, to kick it off.
Thank you so much, Katie, and good morning. And as Katie said, welcome to this session. It's Overcoming Problems Leaders Are Faced with Today. I'm really excited to be joining you today. My name is Richard Merrill. I'm a partner with Elire, and I'll be doing a little more of an introduction of myself in just a minute. But for this session, after some initial introductions, we really want to talk about what is a leader versus a manager, and then talk about common problems that we know many leaders are facing today. These might be problems that some of you are facing. They may be problems some of Elire has been helping you to overcome. And then we want to spend most of the time talking about how to overcome them, how to provide focus to your team, how to achieve clarity and alignment, and how to enable your team to evolve and adapt. And as we like to do when we get into those, we like to move really beyond concepts. We like to talk specifics. We like to give you tools. We like to give you methodologies. We like to give you case examples. So not only in this presentation, but in all the presentations, we'll be getting as specific as possible to make the advice as real as possible. And in some sessions, when we're talking about technology, we'll even be getting into demos. But let's start off again with some introductions. So for those who do not know us, we are Elire, and we were founded in 2005, celebrating 15, actually a little more than 15 years of business. And we, at the end of the day, partner with our clients. We work with them to efficiently implement, integrate, optimize, upgrade their software investments. And what we want to help them achieve is really unlocking the power of those software investments. And we do that by providing a lot of strategic guidance. We do that by helping you figure out how to use the best practices built into the software, how to transform your business operations so you're just not lifting and shifting problems into new technology. And at Elire, one of the hats I wear is leading management advisory services. And my team focuses on providing application roadmaps so you can figure out what is the right technology for you. We also do a lot of work with business process improvement, whether that's understanding how the process works today or how it should work in the future. In addition to that, we support the other areas of Elire in terms of end user adoption and change management. So what can we do to make sure that people are ready to use these software investments? And then understanding what are the implications of the process? How is the process working? And really enabling that through data analytics and visualization, as well as in overarching project management. And I pause on all of those because what we want to do is make sure that you are all aware that those are all sessions that we're covering today and tomorrow. So if you haven't signed up for additional sessions, I really encourage you to go out to elire.com and check the catalog for today and tomorrow, and check out other sessions that are going to be available to you. And of course, feel free to share your experiences with #StrategySummit21. So a little bit more about me. I mentioned I wear a couple of hats at Elire. One of my other hats is head of service execution. And that's really just a fancy way of saying I'm in charge ultimately of all the projects we're delivering, to our clients. And I don't do that alone by any stretch of the imagination. I work with 7 other partners who are dedicated to delivery, whether as a service center of excellence lead or practice lead, as well as non-partners who are I work side by side with, and we call them practice leads and focus areas leads, as well as all of our consultants. So we're really all working together to become your trusted advisor and to really deliver on what we sell. And I like to bring my own experience to the equation. I've been doing business transformation, strategy, process improvement, and change management now for about 25 years and working on all types of technology within the Oracle universe and beyond, as well as working on non-technology projects, whether they're organizational redesign, or just, good old-fashioned process improvement. So I'm happy to share my 25 years of experience, as I know all the other partners, practice leads, focus leads, and consultants at Elire are as well. So just a little plug for our organization. Let's get into the presentation itself. So we start off with what is a leader versus a manager. And the reason we do this is because we don't believe that leaders have to be executives. A leader doesn't come with a title. Now, certainly some people are leaders by virtue of their title, but it doesn't mean they actually act like leaders. We can actually see leaders at all levels of the organization, whether they're project managers or department heads or division heads. And we really see leadership as a frame of mind and as a set of activities as opposed to a job title. And the reason we pause on this is because this presentation is about helping leaders overcome the problems they face today. And part of overcoming those problems is really demonstrating the qualities of a leader. And a leader is someone who challenges instead of maintains. They're looking to think outside the box instead of just doing it the way it's always been done. They're looking to embrace emerging technologies. They're willing to ask what and why, as opposed to how and when. Leaders also try to inspire, how could we do this differently? As opposed to control and just make sure we always do it the same way. And then, of course, leaders are always looking to innovate rather than just use the same tried and true methods that always work. And organizations need managers, right? But organizations also need leaders. And a lot of the problems we're about to talk about, and a lot of this sort of the very practical advice we're about to get into, really is turning to all of us to put our leader hat on and really act more as leaders than managers. So let's talk about some of the common problems that we see some of our clients facing today, and that we, through our research, see a lot of organizations across the world facing today. And we'll start off with two of them. And one is that there are lots of options out there. Options abound and are coming faster than ever. We keep hearing that change is accelerating, and that it's accelerating so fast that maybe this year's must-have technology is actually maybe becoming a little outdated by the time you implement it, especially if your implementation timeline is 1 to 2 years. And a lot of these new exciting changes in technology are developments in AI and big data and automation. We ourselves have 2 sessions at this summit focusing on automation. We also have a session focusing on data analytics. So we ourselves are recognizing a lot of these exciting trends, but we recognize also that these investments can be overwhelming and they can actually have really complicated employee and customer impacts. And aside from change coming at us, there may be change emerging from our own employee bases. I'm not as young as I used to be. I sometimes forget that. And younger employees want more modern experiences. Younger employees are also used to an environment in which the paradigm is shifting faster and faster. They're not used to the paradigm of every 5 to 8 years you get new technology. They're used to the paradigm of, every week you get a new update pushed to your app. So all of these options lead to another problem that leaders are facing, which is juggling priorities, which I know is something many of you do. Time, people, and dollars are just committed to too many projects. And what that can mean is that we are all focused on too many things, causing us not to do any of them well. And in addition to sort of focusing on all these new, cool, exciting initiatives, we also have the age-old problem of balancing how do you keep the lights on versus assigning resources, time, people, dollars to new projects. That's always been sort of that push-pull dynamic. And maybe as a consequence of that, we see that we often talk about quick wins and capturing quick wins and leveraging quick wins and using them to enable and in some cases fund longer term investments. But I think what can tend to happen is because we're juggling so many priorities, that quick wins might get identified and may not actually be realized. Or if they are realized, maybe the benefit isn't fully captured. And again, that can sort of be a problem associated with that because of all those priorities we're juggling. We also think that two problems leaders are facing are around building and keeping consensus. This was actually one of the questions that came up in the keynote this morning. Um, you know, we often see that organization change management focuses on gaining consensus from the beginning, which we of course firmly support and believe in, and is really rooted in all of our methodology, because it is crucial to achieve alignment from the very start of the project. But that's not the end goal, right? The end goal is maintaining alignment, because teams can fall out of love with an idea, which can create barriers, often significant barriers over time. And we might ask ourselves, well, why does that happen? Well, it might be happening because we don't always anticipate the need to reinforce messaging. So we'll be talking today about some practical ways you can do that. How can I reinforce messaging and keep people aligned over time? But then also, people may start to fall out of alignment. Alignment may dissipate over time because of changing internal and external dynamics. There is always something else going on. We live in a very dynamic world that's getting more and more dynamic. And so we need to make sure we're able to adapt and evolve for those. And the final two problems I want to hit on before we get into some real practical solutions and advice is we see that sometimes clients might be hitting icebergs, and we want them to avoid icebergs, right? There might be a tendency to solve only what you see and not the larger underlying problem. And why is that done? Well, it might be done because it's easier to treat the symptom rather than cure the disease, or it's easier to fix what you understand. You may not even understand the root cause or recognize there is a bigger root cause. And then of course, limited resources are always a parameter we have to deal with, right? And that might prevent us from actually tackling the larger issue. And which is a little bit related to that final problem we see that leaders are facing, which is the problem of truly achieving transformation. A lot of investments or ideas that are just small steps forward. We're not taking those radical leaps forward. It can often be easier to take that path of least resistance. And part of that might be because those more difficult paths, the truly transformational paths, have a lot of risk associated with them. And so we want to, sometimes avoid taking those transformational steps. And so these are all problems that leaders, are dealing with. Too many options. How do you make sure you're fixing the right thing? How do you build and keep consensus? And so what we want to do now is really get into some very practical advice. And some of that starts with, providing focus, to your team. And what does that mean, and how do you do that? So the beginning of providing focus to your team is really selecting priorities. So think about it, as you're listening to me, think about what are the goals of my company or my division or my department? What am I really trying to achieve in 2021 or this fiscal year or this reporting period? And then what are those initiatives out there? And some of those initiatives may be maintain in-flight initiatives. They might be keep the lights on initiatives. They might be projects that have already kicked off. They may be new projects, new initiatives that you're thinking about. Well, guess what? All of those consume resources. The in-flight projects, to keep the lights on, the new ideas are all potentially going to consume resources. So you really want to think about prioritizing all of them. And I think sometimes organizations only think about how do I prioritize the new ideas? And when they do that, they forget to include the in-flight projects. They forget to include those initiatives required to keep the lights on. So we really recommend taking a more holistic point of view on focusing on your priorities. And we often advise clients to think about it on the matrix, right? You can see it there. drawing a matrix around impact. You know, how much, if I were to invest resources in this, how much is it really going to help me achieve that goal? And if I invest resources in this, how is it going, what's the timeliness involved? Is it going to help me move the needle in this reporting period, in this calendar year, in this fiscal year? Or is it something that's going to take longer to realize? And we think that that's important to really understand the impact and understand the timeliness, because those that have the greatest impact, that are really getting the timeliness in a desirable manner should be really prioritized more. Now, if that doesn't have to be the only prioritization framework you use. We have sometimes used impact versus risk. We've also used impact versus ease of implementation. And I think the real message here is make sure you come up with a prioritization framework, and that you're not doing it in a black box, right? You're doing it with your team, you're doing it with your sponsors, you're bringing people on board and getting them aligned with what are we going to use for our prioritization criteria, what's the scale, and how are we going to calculate it, and then applying it to all of those various initiatives. And it doesn't have to be a fancy, plot, a grid. It could be as simple as a spreadsheet with the initiatives in one column and ranking parameters in the other columns. So we definitely recommend focusing a lot of efforts on selecting your priorities so that you're not focusing on too many things, that you can really maintain more laser focus. But of course, we know that once the priorities are known, that focus does not magically happen. I wish it did, but it doesn't. And so what we ask leaders to do is really ensure two things, that their team is actually spending time on those initiatives, and that they're actually able to spend time on those initiatives. And this is a test we recommend, and it sounds rather simple, but it can be very powerful. Take a step back and look at your own calendar. Look at your calendar over this week, 2 weeks, maybe the month. Take a few minutes and think about what are my top 2 or 3 priorities based on that framework. And then make sure that your calendar reflects the meetings associated with those priorities, and make sure it maybe reflects heads down time. What time are you blocking off throughout the day to do your heads down non-meeting work? And then actually color code it. And look across that week, that 2 weeks, that month, and see what percentage of time you're actually spending. And if something is your #1 priority, but you're spending maybe only 5% of your time because we're all stuck in meetings all day and running from meeting to meeting, which is something we all deal with, I know that. Then we have to ask ourselves, well, what are all of those other items on the calendar? And as a leader, if my priority is to focus on X, then why am I spending my time on everything else? And that starts to bring up, maybe some difficult conversations about maybe some of those things shouldn't be a priority, especially if they scored low in the framework. Or maybe some of those things can be delegated away. Or maybe we don't actually have to be in all of those meetings. Maybe we can, if we had better note-taking, better use of RAID logs, like risks and actions and issues and decision logs, that you could just review the status and the outcome in the RAID log from that meeting rather than actually sitting there for an hour. And it's an exercise we encourage you to do, but also your team, and actually have a very honest conversation about it. And it's really not just about available time, but it's also about dollars. So that same kind of exercise could be done with our budgets. Right? If something is our #1 priority, but consumes an incredibly small portion of the budget, that may be an indicator. Now, in some cases, priorities don't require, lots of costs. Some organizations don't really worry about tracking internal employee time against a budget. So some of those costs might be a little bit hidden. So, budgets and percentage of budget allocated may not be as clear an indicator as the calendar test, but it certainly can be very informative. And then, of course, as you're thinking about this, as you're trying to figure out how do I allocate my time, which is one of our most precious resources, how do I allocate my budgets, how do I encourage my team to do that? we always have to set reserves off to the side, right? If I'm focused, if I work, a 9-hour, 10-hour day, or an 8-hour day, a 7-hour day, and all 7 hours of those are on my number one priority, what happens when something comes up out of the blue, as we know it is going to happen? So we definitely recommend that, providing focus to your team by selecting the right resources, by selecting the right priorities, and making sure that you're actually applying resources against them. I think a lot of organizations spend time selecting priorities and not so much time actually applying resources in a way that maps up against those. So next thing we think you can do beyond, just providing focus to your team is helping to achieve clarity and alignment. And we feel like that can be done with 3 sort of steps. One is define, and then share, and then reinforce. So we're actually going to walk through define, share, and reinforce, and give some tools and ideas and templates that you might be able to use and leverage. Let's start with define. So often an initiative, a project, is trying to tackle a specific problem, right? Trying to overcome a problem. Therefore, it's often helpful to make sure that as you're focusing on that you truly understand the problem. And that can really begin with something as simple as a problem statement. And we recommend that the problem statement can be created in a facilitated manner. In the days when we could all be in a conference room together, it could be on a whiteboard. In our the world we live in now, with Zoom, it can be obviously done with a facilitated, Excel spreadsheet or Word document. It doesn't have to be an overly fancy tool. And what you can do is sort of list the questions. What is the problem? When did it happen? Where does it happen? That could be, where does it happen in the organization? Where does it happen geographically? Where does it happen in the process? Where does it happen in the system? How often does it happen? Who does it impact? And then why do we want to resolve it? So answering those questions, and again, some of this is common sense, but not common practice. Answering those questions can give you a more fully fleshed out idea of the problem. Because again, we're really trying to start with, around creating clarity. And creating clarity often starts with better definitions. And a problem statement is a really great tool to give you a better definition. Now, sometimes when we're looking at a problem statement, we realize maybe that problem is an iceberg, and it's going to require more root cause analysis. We know we're juggling lots of priorities. We spend a lot of time trying to select priorities and apply resources against them. So when we actually select something, we want to make sure we're solving for the right thing and we're not applying resources against the wrong thing. And so we're going to show you 2 simple tools here that can get to the root cause. One is what we call the 5 whys. So the problem statement, and I'll just pop back a second, was, what is it? When does it happen? Where does it happen? How often does it happen? Well, the 5 whys ask the why behind all of that. We said, where does it happen? Well, why does it happen there? If it happens in that geography, in that system, in that step in the process, why is that? If it happens on Monday, if it happens in the 4th day of close, if it happens at open enrollment, then why is that? So it's really going through and making sure you not only know the problem statement, but you know the reasoning behind it. And this, again, can be a very simple facilitated exercise. The same folks who did the problem statement can really be involved in this facilitated exercise, in which you as the leader can bring them together into a meeting. And perhaps the first part of the meeting, you focus on the problem statement, and the second half, or maybe a subsequent meeting, you're focused on the 5 whys. Now, this tool can sometimes be a little limiting. We know that some problems are more complicated than that. So another tool we recommend is a fishbone diagram, also known as the Ishikawa diagram. And if you've worked with Elire before, you know that we refer to pain points, we refer to problems as disconnects. So, and a disconnect is really an effect, and it can have lots of causes. And just like the 5 whys can help you uncover cause, this approach, which is also very simple to facilitate. It could be done in an Excel spreadsheet. It could be done on a white paper. It could be done when we're all together again in a conference room. And it's really about thinking about what is the root cause, or maybe the cause of the cause, the secondary cause. You can see an example there with the primary cause and the secondary cause. And then where is it grouped? Is it something that has to do with people? Is it something that has to do with the process? Is it something that has to do with the environment? So putting it into some of those logical categories can sometimes force us to think just a little bit deeper or a little bit more holistically. Sometimes we jump right to IT causes, or sometimes we jump right to training causes. This can really force you to think a little broader, a little more holistically. Not that you need a cause in all of these different categories, but it might at least beg the question of, is there a cause in one of these categories? Elire also has more sophisticated root cause techniques that we're happy to work with you on and facilitate, such as creating cause maps. But these are two relatively simple exercises that we feel as a leader you could really facilitate with your team, again, around getting a better definition. Because again, we're trying to get clarity and we're trying to get alignment, and that often starts with a definition. And once we have a definition, we then have to really think about sharing it. And one of the ways we like to share is with a project charter. A project charter can really be leveraged to communicate the vision and to get alignment. And it should include a problem statement. And that problem statement we just got done talking about could really be in the form of your project description or your background, or maybe your charter actually says problem statement. It should also talk about what are the goals and deliverables of this initiative. Who are my sponsors? Who are my stakeholders? What's my scope, my timeline, my budget? What are my guiding principles? We'll talk about that more in a minute. And we really do not believe in a 50-page charter. We really think the charter can get down to 1 to 2 pages. You want it to be simple. You want it to be impactful. You want it to be something that you can actually share and communicate. Because at the end of the day, it's a really great tool to helping ensure resources understand and get alignment and understand their own time commitments so that they can then effectively participate. But sharing then moves beyond that, right? It moves beyond just having a charter. It involves kickoffs, and we know almost every project has a kickoff. And Elire projects always have a kickoff, and we always incorporate the charter in some form into that kickoff. But we are also big believers in having kickoffs at each phase. Bring all those people back together as you enter design, or as you enter test, or as you enter training. What are your major phases? What are your major builds? What are your major iterations that you're looking to roll out functionality, and make sure that you're having kickoffs for each of those. And also be able to translate that charter into an elevator speech. If the best way to share is through all of our informal conversations. Even in the world we live in today, we still have informal conversations. We have them in chat. We have them the few minutes as the meeting is gathering. If someone asks you about a project and you really can't tell them anything about it in just a few, like 30 seconds or a minute, it may mean that there is a communication issue. And as you create your charter, you may even draft an elevator speech. And for those who may not know that term, that's the old saying of, in the time it takes to go from between a couple of floors in a building, can you actually explain a concept? There used to be like a 30 seconds or less rule, or a 60 seconds or less rule. But the idea is, can someone actually verbalize and explain what a project is all about? Because if they can't, then they're not really able to share. They're not really able to get alignment. And another way to share is to change champions. Change champions are stakeholders. They might be a leader, they might be a manager, it doesn't have to be. But there are people who are influential in the organization. People know them, people trust them. People know that if they're involved with a project, that they're going to be represented. And we often work at the beginning stages of a project to identify and mobilize change champions, because they can play lots of cool roles. They can certainly be involved in design and testing and everything else. But they can also really help promote training and communications. They can be boots on the ground, so to speak. They can be the spokespeople of the project. And, you know, when you identify these change champions, you want to bring them together and have a kickoff for them as well, right? Introduce them to what is a change champion? What is my role? What is my toolkit that I can use to then share concepts? And as you think about continuing to share and developing a communication strategy, that strategy should be, you know, what are my communications for the change champions so that they can then continue to share, and what are my communications for everybody else? But that strategy should be, you know, what are the modes and methods of outreach? You know, how does this organization like to absorb knowledge? Does everyone start their day on the intranet site? Does everyone start their day with an email? You know, at Elire, we come together once a month for a live from Minneapolis all hands call. We also have communications supported every Monday with the Monday morning news. We also send out, you know, critical communications on a monthly basis to all the key leaders, so that's a document that the key leaders can share in their one-on-one conversations and in their team meetings. So we're using a whole cascade of communication techniques at Elire. So we're not just sort of preaching this to our clients, we're practicing it ourselves. And really understanding what is that matrix of communication events. You know, we ourselves create these again, whether it's a marketing calendar or a blog calendar. You know, how are we going to communicate to our clients, and when are we going to do it? Who's working on it? Who's sending it? What channel are we going to send it through? I always build that for our project teams when I'm engaged in a change management role. What are my communication events all the way through the entire life cycle of the project? You know, I think sometimes we get to kickoff and then we go quiet, but we really need communication all the way to go live and beyond, through stabilization. And that could be a technology go live, it could be a process change go live, it could be a job org go live. But you know, as people ramp up and get closer and closer to it, they need communication to find out maybe how to access training. They need communication around what do I do for cutover? You know, when do I stop entering transactions into the old system and start using the new one? When do I stop following the old process and start using the new one? When do I stop going to person A in the org because now I'm going to be going to person B in the org? People need all of that. And that as we're communicating, we're doing it in a way that's really intentional. You know, your communication could even be divided into sections. This is what we need you to know. This is what we need you to feel, or how we'd like you to feel. And it can be okay to say, change is scary. It can be okay to acknowledge that. And then what we want you to do, because again, we don't want to communicate for the sake of communicating. We really want to lay it out clearly. This is what we need you to know. This is what we'd like you to feel. And this is what action we'd like you to take. Do we want you to sign up for training? Do we want you to stop putting transactions and hold them for a few days because we're about to do a cutover? What specifically is my call to action? And again, it could be as simple as actually dividing an email into those 3 different sections. And so beyond sharing is the need to reinforce, to wash and repeat. One of our co-CEOs always says you have to say something 7 times to make sure it sinks in. And that's not because people aren't listening, it's because people do need that reinforcement. Our change management methodology is really built on that. And I have that picture of ADCAR because we're not the only ones talking about it. ADCAR is another change management methodology that we were big believers in. We incorporate it into everything we do. But even ADCAR, you know, you get 5 letters and the last letter is reinforce. So that's just how important it is. It's something that shows up in a lot of change management methodologies, whether it's McKinsey 7S or anything else, because it's important to constantly reinforce that message to those who are implementing the change, to those impacted by the change. And it goes back to that communication matrix I talked about on the prior slide, and making sure that you're leveraging that, not just for kickoff, but all the way through. And that leaders are engaging in conversations with each other, with those stakeholders, and maybe having uncomfortable conversations, because People are falling out of alignment, if people are putting up barriers, then we really might need to do a good old-fashioned stakeholder analysis. That could include, as a reminder, because this tool has been around a while but doesn't always get used. If you're looking at a stakeholder, how influential are they in terms of influencing the success of this initiative, right? If they're incredibly influential versus less influential, and then what's their level of interest? Are they really interested or are they not so interested? And sometimes we find people who are our biggest champions and our biggest keys to success, and they're in that sort of upper quadrant and we forget about them. But this type of analysis reminds us, well, we can't forget about them because there may be an internal or external change that occurs that causes even them to fall out of alignment. So we really want to be managing them closely and engaging them closely. What does that mean? It might mean putting them on a steering committee. It might mean including them in communications. But then there are other folks who are very influential to the success or the likely success of the project who have less interest. And sometimes we can want to avoid those people, but we really have to put on our leader hats and engage in those conversations because we want to get them satisfied, keep them satisfied. And then, of course, folks who are less influential, even though they may not have a lot of influence on the overall outcome, if they're very involved, very interested, we want to keep engaging them, right? So think about, having that conversation about who are your stakeholders and where do they live within that quadrant, and do you have people in one quad that you might need to migrate to another quad? Or do you have a quad that's largely empty that maybe you need to go out and recruit and get some more people into that quad? Another step around reinforcement is guiding principles. And I mentioned this very briefly in the project charter, but we have some examples here. But guiding principles are at Elire what we like to think of as guide rails. They help the project stay focused and on track. They can really help define culture of the team or culture of the project. And they can help define what's important in order to achieve a goal. We have some examples here, such as, org design, process redesign, or IT implementation, like reducing manual paper, or reducing waste, or removing customizations. These guiding principles can really be part of your communication and really help you reinforce the communication. If everyone knows that this whole project is about eliminating manual work, then that's helping reinforce the message as we go along. So the final area we want to talk about, now that we've talked about providing focus to the team, we've talked about achieving clarity and alignment, is really enabling the team to evolve and adapt. And evolving and adapting often means continuous improvement. It is something for those who attended the kickoff this morning. There's a continuous improvement cycle that Susan Page, the author of one of my favorite books, who did the keynote, spoke about this morning. And in that cycle, it's around evaluating, testing, assessing, and executing. And the reason that's important is because we all know, hopefully we all know what it's like to get over the mountaintop, right? To achieve the goal. And when that happens, it can be the culmination of a lot of work, a lot of effort. And, sometimes the tendency might be to regress back into a state of stasis, go back to where everything just freezes again. We achieved our goal, let's freeze. But what we really want to encourage is not to, as a leader, to not fall into that mindset, not let the team fall into that mindset. Now we're not trying to say change for the sake of change is good. And we're not trying to say, don't take a minute to smell the roses and capture the benefits of what you just achieved. But we are trying to say is you need to be thinking about, you've hit a goal. How do you keep it going? How do you keep moving? And implementing a continuous improvement cycle, implementing a continuous improvement structure are two sort of practical ways to do that. And I won't go into that a lot. I definitely recommend, we'll be sharing, for those who missed the keynote, we'll be sharing that recording because I think Susan Page does a good job talking about that. Let's talk about measuring success, because How do you know if you actually got over the mountaintop unless you're measuring it? Well, how do you know to continuously improve if you don't know your baseline and where you are now? And we know metrics are not easy, right? This slide might be the least favorite slide of a lot of our clients, but it is important. And because what I often say is what doesn't get measured, doesn't get done. And so we have a recommended approach around defining the metrics to determine the success. We have tools in place, where you actually will build out a spreadsheet of, what is the metric? What's the data source? Who gives you the data? Where does it come from? What table is it coming from? How is it actually calculated? You go through the steps to fill in that type of matrix for that metric, and then actually capture the data and estimate it for current state. And then, of course, be thinking about, as you're working on your initiative, as you're working on that process improvement, as you're working on that IT implementation, what's the future state data source going to look like? And how can I build that into my design? How can I create a report for it? How can I create a query for it? How can I create a feedback mechanism for it? And if I can't create it, can I estimate it? And then, and don't stop there. Think about, okay, is it going to actually be a report? Is the data going to be easy to consume? Is it going to have an owner who actually looks at the report and monitors it? And there'll be a session later on in the summit around data analytics and visualization, where Dayton Paul, one of our consultants, will be sharing with you a lot of cool data visualization tools that we think can make a lot of this a lot easier. But one metric for an IT project that people often think about is user adoption. So user adoption, it can be thought of in a couple of ways, right? You have the need to adopt new features, and you have the need to adopt existing features. And I might think about it myself. We have an enterprise level time and expense system from Oracle that we use as consultants to enter our time on our projects. We also use it to enter expenses. There's existing features in there that you can manually key it every time. There's also features that you can do basically, an Excel upload into it that actually reduces a lot of steps. There's also features around, don't start from scratch every time, but actually copy the previous report and then edit it. All users actually using that existing feature. And you might ask that about yourself. Maybe that feature is around, entering a transaction online versus uploading it, whether it's a journal or an AP, or whatever else. But then there's also new features, right? We worked with a client last year that rolled out an enormous suite of really cool self-service technology for HR. And that was something that was going to be brand new to the organization. And then as you think about user adoption, it's not just new versus existing. And I think sometimes people only focus on the new, they don't focus on the existing, right? If I have a cool time-saving feature that's always been out there, but no one ever uses it, that's a problem, and I need to be aware of it. I don't want to just think about adoption on all the cool fun stuff, right? There's a lot of tried and true methods out there, are people using it? And when we think about it, are they new users or existing users? And, according to the BLS, turnover can range everywhere from 12 to 15% a year in corporate America, which means on a user base of 10,000, that could be 1,500 new users a year. And so in this tool, it's really asking you to think about it. So I'll use my own example, for an existing consultant who's using our time and expense system, are they actually in that routine bucket? Are they using that functionality? Now this says adoption is irrelevant, and I actually left that there on purpose because I think that's a trap a lot of people fall into. I think you really want to know if they're using it or not, and you want to measure it. And then for consultants we're bringing on board, is that they're new? Is that an existing feature that they're going to start using, right? And what's the time to the first usage? Then there might be that new functionality in my example of rolling out employee self-service. All of my folks who've always been around, who've always done it the old way, Are they actually using that new feature? And what was the average time to first usage versus new employees that are coming on board? Maybe it's just a flag. Did they use it or not, right? But think about segregating users, segregating features, and trying to come up with metrics like that. And again, we know it's not always easy. And we kind of have a decision tree where we talk about, is it measured today? And if it is, great, gather the data. Maybe there's timestamp information. Maybe there's flags in the system. Maybe there's some mechanism in place. Maybe the report already exists. If it doesn't exist, the data is already there, just gather it and report it. But if it's not measured today, then the question is, can it be measured? So yes, the system could tell you that if you turned on some functionality like an audit table. And sometimes we worry about turning on audit tables because we think it might have a hit to performance. Again, for those who are worried about that, I encourage you to attend that data analytics and visualization session because there's a way to get access to data without as much a hit to performance. But what if, if it can be measured, let's turn it on and let's generate that report, make sure we have an owner of it and get it out there. But if it can't be measured, maybe it can be estimated. And if it can be estimated, that might be through engaging your change champions, right? We talked about having boots on the ground. Maybe you ask them, maybe you take a qualitative survey of a small group of folks. And ultimately, if it can't be estimated, maybe it's not a good metric to use. But what we want to do is not fall into sort of this quick case study of we worked with a client on a time-saving automation implementation, and they really didn't want to engage in any reporting. For whatever reason, as much as we work to influence them, they just were not as necessarily open to that. And then what happened was, of course, once we go live, they then realize that they're not able to quantify their benefits. Did we actually estimate, automate, and how much? Okay, we're now automating, but we'd like to have continuous improvement and go the next step. But they weren't actually able to develop that, right? Because they didn't have that information at their fingertips, and they ultimately ended turning on all of those metrics. So it's sort of a case study of an organization that was a little leery of it, but then embraced it, and it made a success, a big success for them. And of course, this is all about enabling your team to evolve and adapt. So that might mean having a mechanism to get input from your employees or others for new projects, but then putting boundaries on that, right? We don't want to be getting all these great new ideas and then falling into that trap of losing focus and juggling too many things. So if you're gonna have that input mechanism, make sure you put them through your framework. We talked about that prioritization framework, which is there again, on your screen. And then of course, sometimes ideas and input isn't about the new project. Sometimes it's about the in-flight project. So how are you getting input? How are you getting ideas? How are you adjusting? Because oftentimes we need to push against scope creep, but sometimes we might actually need to adjust the scope, right? And if we do so, how do we update the charter? How do we define it? How do we communicate it? How do we reinforce it along the way? And so, in summary here, and I want to make sure we have enough time to ask some questions. Again, it's really all about providing focus to your team, not picking too many things and juggling too much. It's about making sure that your team can actually dedicate time to something. It's about achieving clarity and alignment, through defining it, through communicating it, through reinforcing it. And then, of course, it's about evolving and adapting, which means having a conversation about metrics, making sure did I achieve success, and how can I continue to measure it so I can monitor as I evolve, and making sure I might have some sort of continuous improvement feedback mechanism as well. So I hope that was helpful and to all of you. And so we do want to take a few minutes here to see if there are any questions. And as a reminder, all of these sessions will end about 5 minutes before the hour, so we give time people to get to their next session. And so I'm just going to click on the Q&A and read some of these questions. So are there tips to avoid being stuck in meetings all day? Sometimes I ask myself, what am I even doing in this meeting? The wrong people were invited, or we might meet for an hour and not, and then not know, what was accomplished. So yes, there are ways to that. And one tool we use is a Grippy. Well, two tools. One is a RACI and one is a Grippy. A RACI is a stakeholder identification tool that lets you know who's responsible, who's accountable, who's consulted, who's informed. Some of those people need to be in the meeting, and guess what? Some of them don't need to be in the meeting. And then for the people that need to be in the meeting, let's use another tool called a Grippy, which stands for goals and roles and interpersonal agreements and the process for how you accomplish it. And it's a way to really keep everyone aligned and on task, on point, on topic in the meeting. And if things are kind of going a little bit askew, then another tool is a parking lot. Let's acknowledge that feedback. Let's acknowledge that comment. Let's record it, but then let's move on and make sure we're accomplishing the goal of the meeting. So a lot of very practical tools around a RACI, a Grippy, parking lots that can be used. Now, another great question around how many change champions do you recommend? Is it one or several? We did a rollout last year with 20,000 users in over 100 facilities in all 50 states with round-the-clock shifts. So we ended up needing a couple of hundred change champions because we wanted boots on the ground in all facilities at all times of the day. We didn't want the people in the second shift and the third shift to say, oh, I have a question, but I have to email, right? We wanted them to have access to a change champion. We've done other projects where it's just, a handful or maybe a dozen in all of the key departments. So I think the number of change champions is really dependent upon the scope of the project, the scope of the user base, the scope of the geographical spread out. But regardless of how many there are, you want to make sure that they understand their role and that they have the training and knowledge, to effectively perform that role. And so let's see another question. What role do you feel high-level executives should play in the actual communication? Should key messaging come directly from them? And I think yes. We actually like to record, if we can, videos. We in our change management journey, we talk about getting alignment from the start, and what a great way to do that by having that key executive show up at the kickoff, and then maybe having them record a 3 to 5 minute video. Maybe more 3 minutes than 5. We know people like short videos, and then distributing that throughout the organization. We think it's a great way to keep them engaged and to know that for the regular folks, right, for all of us, that they really care about this. And then you mentioned the keynote several times, but I missed it. Can I access it? That, yes, you sure can. So after the conference, we're going to be sharing links to all the presentations. We'll certainly be making sure you get copies to everything that you participated in, but we'll be making sure that these recordings are available to everyone else who attended. As I mentioned in the keynote, we have a large turnout for this, over 75 organizations represented. We know not everyone can attend every session. Some organizations have 2, 3, 5, 6 people attending. Maybe they're spreading it out. We definitely want to make sure that that content is available to you so that you can not only review it on your own, but share it with your friends. So it looks like that takes care of the open questions. Thank you to Katie for helping moderate that and ticking off the ones I answered. So in a few minutes, again, we'll be ending in just about 1 minute, but in a few minutes, I'll be in another presentation with just a really exciting partnership for Elire. Jay is going to be co-presenting with me. It's a process session, and it's about improving AP processes to make them more efficient. So it's some really cool cutting edge emerging technology to really turn the dial on AP. So we hope you all can join us. That is a Central Time. The link is available in the chat. If you're not registered, you definitely have time to join us. So thank you all so much. And I'll be seeing some of you in just a few minutes.